I can still recall every moment of that day, the day the world ended. The war with the humans had been the longest and most bitter conflict we had ever fought. By the time it was over, our fleets had nearly been destroyed and half of our colonies were in ruins. But none of that reached us on our home planet, Tyrax. To us, the fighting always seemed far away, somewhere across the vast reaches of the galaxy. We noticed the trade with outer colonies dropping and heard the messages of condolence for soldiers at the front. But that was war. It had always been war. We were a martial people, used to defending our interests across the galaxy. The fighting never touched Tyrax itself. Never. We lived our lives, confident that the war would always be somewhere beyond the horizon. True, trade ships dwindled, and 9 out of 10 docks were empty. The number of grieving families increased until it seemed everyone knew someone who had been lost, captured, or disappeared. But still, we never considered the possibility that we might lose. Even when times were toughest, we Tarians thrived. Our greatest strength revealed when things seemed darkest. If the enemy hit us hard, we'd fight back twice as fiercely. In the end, we believed victory would be all the sweeter for it. Tyrax never backed down. We never gave up. We certainly didn't make peace with the humans. So, when our government announced our surrender, it was a shock, an impossible one. Everyone's first reaction was that it couldn't be true. Surely it was a mistake, a leaked worst-case scenario or a typographical error, or maybe the humans were surrendering instead. But over the next 24 hours, more and more confirmations came in, and it became undeniable. Our government had concluded we had lost, and we had no choice but to surrender. The hours that followed were surreal, almost dreamlike. The whole world seemed to freeze. People stopped going to work or school, wandering the streets in a daze, not knowing what to do. How could this happen? We'd never surrendered, not in 1,000 years, not in 100 wars. Our military was the best in the galaxy, and the conflict with the humans had started in our favor. We had wiped out an entire human fleet with our first strike and overrun their nearby colonies before they could respond. We had every strategic advantage. But then the truth set in. The humans, our mortal enemies, had been sending supplies to the Revan during our wars with them. Their colonies had been encroaching deeper into our sphere of influence. They were ruthless, taking anything they could get their hands on and showing no mercy to those who resisted. It was hard to believe, but it was happening. Fear began to spread. Stories of what had happened to our outlying colonies reached Tyrax: mass executions, purges, forced labor, and daily violence. Worse things spread through whispered rumors. Some people even took their own lives before the first human even set foot on Tyrax, preferring death to the suffering they feared would come. The government urged us to endure for the sake of future generations, but some questioned why we should even listen to them anymore. Those who protested were imprisoned, and a sense of unraveling began to take hold. Small protests arose, but they were quickly shut down, the authorities taking swift action to restore order. It wasn't until a month later, after the proclamation, that the humans finally arrived in orbit. The day we surrendered wasn't met with panic, but with resignation. If this was the end, we would face it as we always had, with pride. Many said their goodbyes and locked themselves in their homes, contemplating what might come next. When the human fleet arrived in orbit, it was an overwhelming sight. Their battleships were not larger than ours, but there were so many of them, more than twice the size of our largest fleet. This was what the humans had after 4 years of war, and it became clear why we had lost. The official surrender took place in the empty hangar of the human flagship, broadcast live across Tyrax. We expected our leaders to be forced to admit defeat, apologize for waging war against a superior species, and swear allegiance to the conquerors. But instead they were handed pens and asked to sign a document recognizing the surrender terms. There was no execution, no bloodshed. Our leaders gave the formal oath of allegiance, but it was almost an afterthought. It seemed like the humans didn't even consider it important. And then, to our surprise, the worst fears of purges and executions did not materialize. The first human dropships landed, and the occupation forces began to take control. I watched from my apartment window as tanks, armored vehicles, and soldiers marched through the streets. It was surreal. These were the forces that had defeated us, and we hadn't even realized what we were up against until it was too late. We had been so overconfident, so blinded by our own military prowess, that we had failed to understand the strength of our enemies. Yet, as I watched the human soldiers, something unexpected happened. One soldier broke off from his column and gently picked up a child who had wandered into his path. He treated her with surprising care, handing her something to eat before returning to his position. It was a moment that caught me off guard, a small act of kindness from an enemy I had been taught to fear and despise. I couldn't help but wonder if we had been wrong about the humans. Maybe they weren't the monsters we thought they were. As the days passed, I started to see that the humans weren't here for genocide. There were no mass purges or brutal crackdowns. A few people were arrested for war crimes, but nothing like what we had feared. Life went on, almost like it had before, but now under the supervision of the humans. I even began to work with one of their officials, a human named Doug, who turned out to be amiable and competent. He showed more consideration than any of my Treon supervisors ever had. Over time, I realized that the surrender hadn't been the end of the world. It had been the end of the old Tyrax. But perhaps a new, better one could emerge from the ashes. Working with the humans, we might rebuild our world into something prosperous. It was a hard truth to accept, admitting that so many lives had been lost in a pointless war, but it was undeniable. The humans had won, but it wasn't the end of the world. It was just the beginning of something new,